This is my favourite calculator, but it's run out of battery. So instead of buying some more batteries from the shop that will last like a year, I'm going to create a nuclear powered calculator that will last 20 years. So a nuclear powered calculator might sound kind of crazy, but we're not building a fission reactor here. That's a future video. Joking. All we're going to do is scavenge some energy from natural radioactive decay. And the concept's actually pretty old. NASA's been using nuclear batteries for the last 50 years to power spacecraft that can't survive on solar power alone. A famous example is the Voyager probes, you know, the ones carrying the golden record. They've just reached interstellar space a few years ago. They're obviously so far away from the sun that they can't be powered by solar power. They each have about 4 kilograms of plutonium in them, which is giving off a significant amount of heat, and a thermoelectric generator is harvesting the heat and creating enough electricity to power the systems on the probes. But as they've both been running for 45 years now, the energy output of the nuclear batteries has significantly reduced, so NASA's starting to shut down some of the less essential systems to conserve power. And they won't be able to run for too much longer, but 50 years is a pretty good run for a battery. This type of battery is called a radioisotope thermoelectric generator because heat from the radiation is being turned into electricity through an array of thermocouples. And this technology was actually also used to create some pacemakers that could last potentially like 80 years, which is way better than the sort of 5 to 10 years you get on regular pacemakers before they have to be surgically removed. And they did actually successfully implant them in about 120 patients, but eventually the project was scrapped because they realized that even though they would tell the patients, you know, not to be cremated, they couldn't really control what happens. You know, maybe some family members would decide to cremate someone, and you really don't want those ashes getting scattered in Disneyland or something. So they decided the risk was too much, so they scrapped the project. But there are still a few people out there today, like walking around with plutonium in their chest. About 9 people, I think, 50 years later. So that's pretty cool. But yeah, so back to my battery. So I looked online and it's not particularly easy to get hold of a few kilograms of plutonium. So I'm going to need a slightly different approach for my radioactive battery. And so rather than using heat, I'm going to use light, specifically these green radioactive rods that look like something out of the starting sequence of The Simpsons. So these tubes are full of an isotope of hydrogen that doesn't really want to exist, called tritium. It's slowly decaying into helium with a half-life of about 12 years, releasing electrons in the process, aka beta radiation. And these electrons hit the phosphorescent coating on the inside of the tubes, which creates this green glow. And so with a half-life of about 12 years, although these tubes will start to dim, they'll keep visibly glowing for at least 20 years. So here's the idea. We can take these tubes, sandwich them between a couple of solar panels, and so then the radiation hits the phosphorescent coating, which creates visible light. The visible light hits the solar panel turns it into electricity, and that's what's known as a radio photovoltaic battery. And importantly, we're going to use a type of solar panel called amorphous silicon solar panel rather than a crystalline silicon solar panel, because the amorphous silicon actually produces more electricity at low light, but works less well in sunlight, so it's the type of ones you get on those little solar powered calculators. So at this point you might be thinking, if you want a calculator that doesn't need batteries and won't run out of charge, why not just use the solar panel? So I got this mini calculator because it had the smallest display I could find, so hopefully it needs the smallest amount of power and we might have a chance of actually getting it to work. So it looks like this calculator needs a minimum of 1 volt to make the display visible enough to see, and we should be able to get that with 2 solar panels and using all 5 of the tritium tubes inside. So I evenly spaced the 5 tritium tubes on some tape and then sandwiched it in between the solar panels, and then I wrapped the whole thing in aluminium foil to prevent any external light getting in and cheating and stop any radiation getting out. And then I added some labels to the build to make it look cooler. And I started disassembling the calculator. So I took out the button cell and soldered one of the contacts of the nuclear battery onto the battery pad, and I added a 100 microfarad capacitor in parallel with the battery so it can build up charge in the capacitor when it's not in use, so hopefully it has enough power to actually turn on when we want to use it. So I put the calculator back together and then taped the battery to the back of it, and then I had a quick check with the guide counter just out of interest to see how well the radiation shielding was doing. You can see just a little bit comes out of the sides of the solar panels. So I left it overnight to charge, and the next day I tried it out and it actually turned on, which I wasn't really expecting. And it lasted for about 30 seconds before it ran out after like 10 hours of charging, so not very impressive, but honestly the fact that it works at all is enough for me. I really wasn't convinced that the tiny amount of light that these little tritium tubes were putting out would be enough to create any useful power, but I guess over 10 hours, you know, when they're pressed right up against the solar panels, it generates a few milliamps of current. So now I guess I have this emergency calculator that I can use for a minute per day to do some, you know, very important calculations if my phone dies. I don't really know what I'm going to do with it. But the cool thing is that it will still probably work in 10-15 years for a minute at a time. Whereas like if you left some alkali batteries in a calculator, come back in a couple of years, it's like a corroded mess, you know, which is always annoying. And it's nuclear powered, which is just cool. So yeah, thanks for watching. See you next time.